Today we've got the practice pad out because we are talking technique. Now, there's a lot of information out there on hand technique, and what I have for you today is a way that I think about it and explain it to students that I think is fairly simple, easy to understand, and something that's actionable as well. You can actually practice the things that we're talking about. Now, with that said, this is in no way the only way to think about technique, and it is definitely not necessarily the best way to think about technique. There's lots more to explore beyond the concept that I'm going to introduce today. But with that said, we're going to jump right into it because I think it's fairly easy to understand. We're going to think of our arms in terms of three distinct gears. We're going to think of our forearm as one gear, our wrist as another gear, and our fingers as our third gear. Proper technique that allows you to play faster, for longer, more comfortably, requires you to be adept at using all three of those gears seamlessly. The first gear we're going to talk about, which basically everyone has control of the first day that they start playing drums, is the forearm. So the forearm, the benefits that it's very easy to control right off the bat. You get a lot of power from your forearms, but at the expense of speed. So like I said, most drummers will start using only this first gear, their forearms. And you know this because you see a lot of beginner drummers kind of playing like this, right? No wrist, no fingers, it's just all forearm. Now, using your forearm alone is going to be pretty bad technique in almost any scenario, but the next gear that drummers tend to naturally kind of start using or unlock as they become a little more intermediate is the wrist. So the wrist is a great balance of allowing for more speed. There's also a fair amount of power, and there's a decent amount of control that you have access to right away. And if you want to start working on your wrist control, you want to think about locking up your fingers, locking up your wrist, and only playing strokes with your wrists. You might try this with just your right hand, just your left hand. And if you find it difficult to isolate the wrist and you kind of naturally want to get some forearm in there, you can hold your forearm and just watch yourself and make sure that it is only the wrist being engaged. To clarify, I'm not suggesting you practice this because you should play that way, but it's important to practice like this to know what it feels like to specifically engage the wrist. Now, once you have some control over your forearms and your wrists, there's actually a fair amount that you can do technique-wise around the drum set, and you can really do quite a lot by properly engaging the forearm and the wrist, respectively, in the situations where it's appropriate. Again, getting more power from your forearm and getting a little more control and more speed from your wrist. And of course, these two things work in conjunction together, as they will with the fingers, once we start to bring that in. Now, this is where a lot of drummers get hung up, and a lot of kind of intermediate drummers stay in that intermediate level, and they don't really know like how to get faster, how to play longer, more comfortably. And this is where finger control comes in. This is our third gear, which, like I said, for a lot of people kind of never gets unlocked. But our third gear is our fingers, our back fingers on the stick. Of course, we're assuming matched grip here. It's the back fingers on the stick pulling the stick to get that stroke. The big benefit we get from this is the speed that we can get out of these fast twitch muscles in our fingers, and the drawbacks are that it's somewhat difficult to control until you've practiced this, and you don't have quite as much power as you would have with your forearm or your wrist. So to work on unlocking this gear or unlocking your fingers, you want to do the same sort of isolation exercise where you make sure that your forearm is not doing anything, you're not being assisted by your wrist either, and that you can bounce the stick and get consistent strokes only using the fingers. So you can see here that as much as possible, I am not moving my forearm, I am not moving my wrist. Sometimes you'll get people that are doing this kind of thing, right? And they're kind of secretly engaging their wrist. You want to lock it up and make sure that you are only using your fingers to play. This is great because, again, it lets you play a lot quicker, more comfortably, but at the expense of control, which is kind of difficult to maintain, and definitely power as well. With that said, here is a really important takeaway and sort of where the metaphor to gears breaks down. Now, with actual gears in a car, you switch distinctly from one gear to the next. And correct me if I'm wrong, engineers, I don't know if there's any sort of engine where you can be in multiple gears at once, or if there's some sort of hybrid engine system that works like that. But for our purposes, we actually want to focus on blending these different gears together at the appropriate times. You are going to use more or less fingers, wrist, and forearm depending on what you're doing. A perfect illustration of this idea would be the 3-stroke Moeller method, which I'm not going to teach here, but would look something like this. Which, if you're watching closely, you can see is requiring a blend of the forearm, wrist, and fingers. So that's what I call the gears approach to thinking about technique. It is not significantly different from many of the great teachers of technique and the way they explain hand technique. It's just a slightly different method that I have found helpful in explaining to students and conceptualizing my own technique when I am working on it. And for those of you that feel like you're stuck and you can't break past a certain tempo barrier, like there's something that could be improved about your technique, inspect and see, are you using all forearm? Are you using all wrists? Have you not engaged the fingers at all? You can go through some of these isolation exercises and see, like, do I really have control over my finger technique, my wrist technique, and my forearm technique? Then start thinking about how all three of those blend together as you're playing around the kit. I would also love to know if you have any ways of thinking about technique or any tips that are related to this that you can drop down in the comments. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.